This video will show you how to submit your podcast to iTunes to make sure you're listed in the iTunes store. So first important thing is that you can only submit your podcast to iTunes once there is one podcast at a minimum posted on your site. So make sure before you submit it that you go to podcast and then all episodes, and then make sure that you have at least one episode with an audio file attached in here. Many of the errors that you can get when submitting to iTunes will come about because people forget that you can't submit a podcast to iTunes before it has a podcast episode in it. So make sure you have an episode posted. Next step is to get your podcast feed. So this is an important thing. The podcast feed is a page full of what's called XML code. It's a programming language. That basically gives iTunes or any other directory information about your podcast episodes. So it's not enough to give it the web address to your podcast site, as in thepodcasthost.com/tutorial podcast. That is just your site, that is not your feed. So you need to get your feed address, and you find that by going into the podcast section and then going into settings, and it'll show you your feed address in here. And your feed address is right down the bottom of the settings page in the share section. So what you want is your complete feed. So let's copy and paste complete feed, and you can see that it is actually just your website address with a little code on the end, which is $feed equals podcast. So let's copy that, copy, and then let's flick over to iTunes. So what you want to do is load up iTunes. You want to go to, this is the app, you can't do it through the website, you have to do it through the iTunes app. You go to the iTunes store, so this is in the iTunes store, so if you're in your library you need to go over to iTunes store, and then you go to the podcast section, so click podcast there, and you'll find the submit link on the right hand side over here. Scroll down a little bit and it's podcast quick link, and then you've got submit a podcast. So click that, and it's very simple. All it asks for is your podcast feed URL. So we've just copied that, so all I'm going to do is right click in there, paste, there's our feed address, and click continue. Now it may ask for your Apple ID at this point, so just type in your Apple ID and your password if it does ask for that. And then you get to review podcast. So here it'll let you see what information it's found about your podcast. Now that's great because it's picked up our podcast image. That's the one I showed you how to insert earlier on in an earlier podcast. It's picked up our name and our author. There are the details that were in there. Now I didn't change these too much, so short description and long description are the same, but you can change them so they're a bit more detailed, and you can change your category. So let's go for education, and subcategory training, so it's training about podcasting, and then we can click submit. So that'll go off and it'll get reviewed, and within hopefully a few days to a week your podcast will appear in the iTunes store with the correct information, and that's us done. So that's how to submit your podcast to iTunes. Good luck with the process.